Existing buildings, though, I was very aware that the last question and answer session actually started to cover things that I was going to be saying anyway. But certainly a great deal of emphasis needs to recognise the fact that energy performance of buildings which already exist is probably the main challenge within Europe. We heard some very forceful presentations in Bremen from people who were talking at the kind of worldwide level. And what was useful there was that they were able to demonstrate using scientific evidence that there are in fact parts of the world which are developing at such a rate, most notably China, that the emphasis almost certainly in the next few years needs to be on the design of new buildings. Because energy efficient buildings in China are being designed and built at such a rate that the effect, if that is allowed to continue, could be environmentally catastrophic. If we look at the European situation, though, as has already been said by a couple of speakers this morning, most of the buildings which will exist, certainly by 2020, have already been built. So we need to make sure that new buildings that are constructed are going to be something that we want to pass on to future generations. But on the other hand, we need to recognise that the real challenge for Europe perhaps exists in a slightly different format. Within Scotland, and I gave a very brief presentation to the Build with Care team when they visited Scotland last time, there have actually been quite a lot of initiatives that AMAR and others have been involved with, looking particularly at historic buildings and trying to develop ways in which we can try to improve the energy performance of historic buildings. One of the things that I find slightly perplexing and what bothers me slightly about the approaches being taken across the whole of the UK, not within Scotland, is that sometimes the argument with historic buildings is almost, okay, we recognise that we need to increase or improve the performance of old tenement buildings, but this can't possibly be at the expense of ever covering up any plasterwork. It can't ever be at the expense of changing the windows, or it can't ever be at the expense of actually doing anything significant to the building. So although we see Historic Scotland undertaking demonstration projects in the Royal Mile, where they're covering up the outside of buildings with insulation and so on, I find it very hard to believe that that is actually going to be rolled out on anything like the kind of scale that we perhaps need to be thinking about things. So I think that kind of coming back to what I said about transformational behaviour and thinking about the behaviour of occupants are maybe things that we need to address quite closely. I was interested in Genevieve's question about the fact that as we reduce heating bills, maybe people actually are aware, well, look, I've now got more money that I can spend on running televisions and computers and so on. I've been to so many conferences now where people point out that there are technical solutions needed for buildings which are poorly insulated, but a lot of the solution can actually come from people simply putting on a jumper during the winter months, or people taking off, or people changing their air conditioning system slightly. Anybody who reads the journal Energy and Buildings will have read many reports of buildings which actually consume more energy when there is nobody in the building. There was a staggering study came out of India last year showing that buildings were being vacated by office workers at 5 o'clock in the evening, but nobody was thinking to switch off the air conditioning system. So the buildings were using far more energy trying to maintain a level 21 or 22 degrees centigrade during the night time than they were actually using when people were in the building. So we need to, it's not just the behaviour of the people using the building, it is the behaviour of, as you were pointing out, facilities managers and the people designing the buildings. I've got two kind of interesting photographs here. USA may recognise these photographs, of course. They're from the southern part of Sweden, but I spend far too much of my time worrying about new urbanism and trying to understand why do people want to live in artificially old-looking buildings. But I've included these because I thought they were nice examples of buildings that you may think these are both kind of examples of medieval buildings, but this, in fact, is from a village. I spend a lot of time in Copenhagen with PhD students who are Danish, so they usually refuse to let me go to Sweden, but they let me go on this particular occasion. So we visited a number of towns on a particularly cold day. The village that's shown in the top photograph is actually, I think the oldest part of the town is about 5 years. So this is a town which has been specifically designed because people want to live in a medieval town. So a new medieval town has been built in the southern part of Sweden. So I can almost guarantee that the buildings here have actually been designed to very high energy performance standards because they will have to meet very recent energy performance standards within Sweden. When we start to think about other towns in the North Sea region, including Lund, Copenhagen, Aberdeen, Dublin, and so on. We are typically, though, looking at much older buildings where we need to make sure that we are actually getting strategies in place to try to deal with the demands of these buildings over the course of the next few years. So there is a need, I would argue, for some new technical solutions that people will actually accept. I would completely accept what you said, that technical solutions are there, but whether or not these are actually being implemented and whether or not people can afford to implement these, I think is a kind of associated question that we need to deal with. Again, I think a colleague from the University of East Anglia, I certainly had a couple of very long discussions with people from that university in Bremen, and most of those discussions centred on the fact that within the UK there's a recognition that we need to deal with the energy performance of existing buildings, but what the government is talking about is we live in times of austerity and there's simply no money available to deal with VAT reduction to kind of support some of these things, and there needs to be more than just a willingness on the part of the building occupants. There needs to be incentives and support to actually help people deal with existing buildings on what will actually be quite a large scale. Now, standards across the region which is covered by the Build with Care project certainly vary, as you would expect. There are certainly regional variations as well within the countries, and what I've included within the report, which is available on the website, is a fairly detailed summary of where you can actually access these existing standards, including some discussion of how the standards have maybe changed over the last 5 years or so, but also I was asking project partners to tell me, all of the partners came from either local or regional authorities. I was asking them to tell me about, did they actually feel that there were likely to be changes taking place in the next few years. The baseline study was prepared then to consider existing carbon emission strategies, to look at construction policy, and to think about building standards, and there are a number of case studies presented as well. So the report itself is presented in two sections, one of which is very much looking at policy across the whole of the region covered by the Build with Care project, and then there's a much longer section that then deals with the countries one by one. There were certainly a number of very interesting transnational factors which I thought I would focus on this morning rather than drilling down to the national level. Local policies and agreements tended to be in place, was what I was hearing from project partners. Most people felt that policies, agreements, advice notes and so on tended to be in place. There was a real frustration coming through though from some of the project partners, and in fact I didn't hear anybody at the particular project meeting saying, well, actually, we don't have any problems with this. There was a frustration sometimes that the advice was not actually translating into practice. So maybe there needs to be something more in terms of, for example, legislation, but there is a qualitative element to this as well, which does actually require education, and it requires partnership working between perhaps end users of buildings where we know who those people are going to be, but certainly greater partnership working between government, planners and designers. Most of the policies across the region that we're looking at tended to be tied to both carbon emission and economic growth. So where there was mention of reduction in carbon emission, the policies tended, what I'm meaning by this is that those particular policies tended to also speak about economic growth. So the policies existing in the partner countries were not simply saying, now we will have an environmental part of our policy, and then later on we will move on to talking about economic growth. There tended to be quite distinct stated links between the two. Energy efficiency schemes were certainly being developed or implemented across the whole of the region. And certainly, of the project partners involved in Build with Care, Belgium and Sweden appear to be the closest towards implementing passive design in new buildings on quite a large scale.